Hello everybody, and thank you for joining me today on this demonstration of a resource for biology students in secondary school. So this video alone can stand as a resource, as sort of a virtual field trip, but luckily enough for us here in Niagara, Ontario, Canada, we have one of the world's most miraculous resources in its purest form right behind us here. This will be our outdoor lab today, and we are going to be talking about biodiversity. Just like any lab exercise or any demonstration of a resource, safety is always first. So one, I always highly recommend taking a photo of the map before you enter places like this. Secondly, do a buddy system or go in groups. Not ideal to go alone. Lastly, make sure you have the appropriate footwear, make sure somebody else knows where you are, and also please stay on the trails for your own safety, let alone the protection of biodiversity. Additionally, I would highly recommend having a first aid kit and water in your backpack, because when you go down into places like this, it is a long ways down. So, what exactly is biodiversity? If you break the word down, it literally just translates to diversity of life. It can be measured by species richness, so the actual number of species present in a geographical area. It could also be measured from a perspective of genetics. So what is the genetic diversity in that area, let alone within one population of organisms? And it can also be measured from a regional scale, the diversity of habitats or the variety of ecosystems in a given geographical area as well. Today, we are going to focus primarily on the species richness, also known as alpha diversity. This is a great conversation spot to talk about the Carolinian Forest Zone. That's where we are today. I would like you to follow along with this exercise, and I would like you to find either a textbook, a standard size piece of paper, or something about that size, maybe even your laptop screen. I am going to use this rock here. So let's suppose that this rock is the entire country of Canada, the second largest country in the world, absolutely massive, okay? Now I'd like you to take just your fingertip, and I'd like you to place it anywhere on either, again, your textbook, paper, or screen. How much of a percent do we feel like the tip of the finger is taking up on all of Canada right now? If you guessed less than 1%, you are correct. And in that area right there is where there are more species of plants and animals than anywhere else in the entire country. That is called the Carolinian Forest Zone. So again, here we are in a prime example of it at the Niagara Gorge. This type of forest is more like that of North and South Carolina and those more southern and eastern temperate states. We get the northernmost limit of the plants and animals more typically found down there, surviving up here in the extreme south of Ontario. But within that area, there are said to be 400 species of birds logged and recorded. That's a national high. There are 75 species of tree, a national high as well. We've got about, give or take, 55 species of reptile and amphibian. You guessed it, a national high. And in the Niagara River, which we'll see shortly, there are said to be about 75 species of fish. Again, you guessed it, a national record. The Carolinian Forest Zone has 1/3 of Canada's rare and endangered listed species. Okay, we've made it to our first objective species, this towering behemoth behind me, known as the tulip tree. Let's take a closer look. Now the video doesn't quite do it justice because I'm standing in the foreground, but this tulip tree is truly gigantic. The tulip tree is said to be the tallest hardwood or deciduous tree in all of eastern North America. The tulip tree here has its name because when it reaches over 20-ish years old or so, it starts to produce these magnificent tulip-like flowers way up top at the canopy, sometimes so high you can't even see them, coming in with certain individuals at 35 meters tall. Now, this one's definitely producing flowers because it's not just 20 years old, it's probably about 250 at my best estimate. It is known for its rough, deep groove corrugated bark. As it gets older, when the tree is younger though, the bark is actually quite smooth. It also has some interesting leaves that look a lot like a maple leaf, except almost with this top pointy part sawed off. This may be a really silly thing to say about a tree, but tulip trees, when they're mature, are known for growing very straight. And if you notice behind me, they actually don't even branch until the very top. Just under 100 meters away from the tulip tree stand is another textbook Carolinian tree species. If you look up, the one that's kind of dancing and S-shaped above my head, that is called sassafras. Sassafras trees are also like the tulip tree, known for their groovy bark, but it's not quite as vertical, and they certainly do not get as large as a tulip tree. Now, what these trees are known for as they get older is they become what I joke and call dancing trees. They love to dance when they get older. Maybe you know somebody like that. Now, here we are, for example, as it reaches up to the canopy, but that's not the coolest part about sassafras. It's all in the leaves. If you look here, it is one of the only tree species in the world, yes, the world, where it can have 3 lobes on one leaf, 1 lobe per leaf, and we can find one that looks like a mitten, 2 lobes on one leaf. That is pretty remarkable. The roots of those groovy sassafras trees you can see behind me there were actually used as a preliminary form of root beer. One of these trees is not like the other. In fact, it is unlike almost every other tree in Canada, let alone the entirety of the Niagara Gorge. We are looking at a Kentucky coffee tree right here, right now. It is one of the only 2 spots in all of Niagara Peninsula where I know this tree grows in the wild. Think about the term Carolinian forest zone, named after North and South Carolina and that general region of the United States where those trees are more abundant. Here we have the Kentucky, same area, coffee tree. The bark is an immediate giveaway, but what about the coffee aspect? When this tree matures a few years further down the road, it will start to produce these seed pods about 1/2 foot long. Inside those pods, again, are seeds, and they were used by some of the first European settlers in the area, and they were boiled basically to make a sort of coffee. On this tour, we've crossed one of the only areas in all of Canada where the tulip tree, the sassafras tree, and the Kentucky coffee tree even grow at the same site. Now, what's impacting this biodiversity? Within this precious Carolinian forest zone, we also have 1/4 of Canada's human population, and we've lost 90% of the original coverage of those habitats. This calls for a conversation about conservation. Say that 10 times fast. Firstly, and most profoundly, is the concept of habitat loss. Now, habitat loss occurs in all areas of the world, and in some areas more severely than others. Again, right here in the most populated area of not just Ontario, but all of Canada, we have lost 90% of our original Carolinian forest habitat coverage. 90%. That is a shocking number, and that makes diversity of species and diversity of genetics incredibly hard to maintain. And we've already lost a lot of species that are either A, extinct, or B, extirpated, meaning they no longer live here at least, thanks to habitat loss for the most part. Another thing we need to consider on the same vein as habitat loss is habitat fragmentation. So if you were to look at a satellite image of the Niagara Peninsula, and all of southern Ontario for that matter, you will notice that the small patches of forests and wetlands remaining are not necessarily connected, but rather they're kind of blotched and segregated from one another. And in that case, we run a risk of what's called genetic inbreeding or genetic islands. It's never a good story for any biological species, and it makes them more prone to disease wipeout as well. So species, especially terrestrial or land-based ones, kind of get landlocked into a protected area like this, but they can't safely or efficiently leave these areas to spread their genetics to other populations of their same species. And genetic inbreeding is never a good story for any biological species, and it makes them more prone to disease wipeout as well. Of course, we also need to talk about climate change. Now, climate change is affecting everywhere in the world at different paces and in different amounts of severity. Thankfully, and for now, that doesn't mean we can become complacent, but Southern Ontario and Niagara region is not heavily impacted by climate change yet. And that's thanks to the Great Lakes surrounding us moderating the climate of this generally temperate and easygoing area in terms of weather in the big scheme of things. Now, having said that, if climate change were to continue for too long, we could see longer, wetter summers, which may bring in new invasive species, especially as our winters are statistically getting weaker and shorter. Now, because the vast majority of the forests and wetlands, as I mentioned earlier, are simply gone in the Niagara region, you can imagine that our creeks and waterways, including the mighty Niagara River here, do not have a lot of filtration on the sides of their banks. Most of our agricultural and urban areas have very little of a buffer between the human activity and the water. So what happens is we have an excess of nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus, for example, that end up in our waterways, and that can cause algal blooms, which then deoxygenates the water, therefore making it less inhabitable for a diversity of species. Also, the amount of soil that can simply wash away into our waterways is astounding in Niagara. That's why after it rains, most of our creeks turn to what looks like chocolate milk. That's because, again, there's no filter or buffer anymore on most of our creek and water systems. So again, not having that shoreline, or also known as riparian habitat, the lack of riparian habitat is affecting our water quality and therefore the biodiversity in it. Well, as they say in the world of hiking, what goes down must come back up. And here we are. So I really wanted to thank you for joining me on my virtual demonstration of a resource today. And on that note, I'd like to take a quick moment, as I'm nearly out of breath here, to mention that this is also the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. These are the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. They are the original custodians of this land, many of which still live, play, and work here to this day. Something to think of and be appreciative of on any day, and today especially. Thank you.